We're gonna have to talk a little bit about size in today's video because mine has just been too big to fill the spot I've been trying to fill in my bedroom. But GMK's review sample they sent over of the NEO X1 Pro actually has been the perfect fit for this space. Now, it is a lot larger than a traditional, integrated GPU mini PC, but it's also a lot more powerful. Now, I've also reviewed mini PCs that are more of basically it's just a laptop without a screen, like this one here from Atom Man that has like a mobile 5070 in it, whereas this GMKtec NEO X1 Pro has a desktop 5070 in it, and that makes for a completely different class of performance, which can be misleading when you're looking at mobile parts. So it's nice to get that desktop class performance. This is a video where I reviewed a mobile 5070 against a desktop 5070. The mobile 5070 only had 8 gigabytes of VRAM, leading to some stutters and issues in some areas. And even when not having issues with the VRAM capacity, it is about a 50% performance difference in a lot of cases, with the desktop 5070 having a huge advantage there. Now, with the GMKtec NEO X1 Pro, you're kind of in between. So it's not as small as something like a Steam machine, but if trying to fit into more of a living room environment, it's not that much bigger than something like a PlayStation 5, which, like I said, like different form factor like this one, I'm not standing vertically, but you get the idea. Like, it's not completely out of place in this sort of a setup the way a full-size tower would be. And so I could even kind of tuck it behind the TV a little bit if needed. Also, it is a desktop style GPU upgrade situation. I took a look at that. You can just easily take off 2 screws to get the case open. And once you open it up, it does just have a desktop 5070 inside. And not that hard to get out of the PC as well. It's connected with the 12 volt high power cable or whatever, but on 5070s, unlike 5090s, I haven't had any melting issues on those. It came with the GPU stabilization bracket there, which was easy to remove, although in a normal desktop PC, if you didn't have one of those, it could be a little quicker to swap out GPUs. But again, it was just 2 screws plus the one on the little actual support bracket itself, came out pretty easily. Another screw on the side to take off the little cover over the other screws that are actually securing the GPU into the case. And then once I had those out, the only part that was a little harder here than on a larger PC was actually just reaching the pin here to unclip the PCIe bracket. Now, I used a very high-tech plastic tool here to reach down because my finger couldn't quite fit. Popped out the GPU, and I was also just curious which 5070 was in here. The one that came with my sample, who knows if any of them would be different, was a Yeston RTX 5070 here. And it overall performed just like any other, desktop 5070, because this is a full desktop GPU. Also, once you've got the GPU out, it's very easy to get access to 2 slots for SSDs. One of them was populated on the version I was sent. I was curious if I could fit a 5080 in here, and it looks like I probably could fit it in the case with the Founders Edition, but I couldn't slot it in without having to remove more of the AIO cooler and such, which I didn't want to get into for just checking if 5080 would fit. But I didn't have quite the room to angle it properly to get it in there. But it does look like you would be able to upgrade the GPU in the future, which is nice and not something that you can do in the more of the mobile style parts that you get in one of these more just laptop-based systems. However, this does actually have some mobile parts in it. It's a little bit unusual. So what this has is it has a 9955 HX3D processor, which is not an actual desktop processor, although it's close in performance to something like 9950 HX3D. Now, my main issue with this in the review is just that Well, first I just looked at the price and I was like, really? $2,900? Then I looked at actually trying to build something similar and getting all custom parts, sorting prices fairly low to high, still came out to about $2,650 or so in the US market with, I'm not trying to match the exact parts, I'm going with actual desktop parts like a 9950 X3D, but my real problem with this is if I was building a desktop PC, I just wouldn't make some of these choices. Now, I'm noticing that on their page, there's the option for a 32 gigabyte RAM and 1 terabyte SSD version, but it doesn't appear to be in stock, and it doesn't have a price listed. That's the version, assuming that an appropriate amount of price was removed, if that one was available, that I think would make a lot more sense for gaming, which is what I'm reviewing here. The review sample that they sent me was 64 gigabytes of RAM and a 2 terabyte SSD. And my problem with that is that for gaming, you don't need 64 gigabytes of RAM, and RAM is incredibly expensive right now. And my other thought was initially, okay, this 9955HX3D, that's a 16-core, 32-thread X3D processor. Again, it's the mobile variant of the 9950 X3D. It's a little less power hungry, so it's not quite exactly the same performance, but I'll do benchmarks here in a second. It is still quite performant. But for a gaming build, if I'm just building a desktop, I would never get the 16-core 32-thread part. I would get the 8-core 16-thread 9800X3D, or maybe even trying to save money and go back a generation for the 7800X3D. And so that's really my issue here, is that it's not so much that for the parts that are here that this price is insane, it's that I could have built a much less expensive system by making different choices in the components. Now, this does come with a motherboard that supports Wi-Fi 7 out of the box, which is nice, and I was getting high-speed connections and everything, also over LAN. I was getting high-speed connections when I was transferring games, etc., when I was looking into the benchmarking. So all of that's fine, and this is a 14.6 liter case. So like I said, this is bigger than a Steam machine, but way smaller than like a 40 liter, full desktop tower, that kind of thing. So like I said, it is actually the case that I am able to fit it behind my bedroom TV, which I was looking to put a PC there. And I actually had been using this one here, this more laptop style 5070 based system. But honestly, the fan noise on this kicks up really high pitch and loud when gaming, whereas I'm not saying that the GMKtec here is completely silent, but it was able to stay a lot quieter and had significantly more performance. And when plugging into a 4K TV, I certainly do appreciate having the 12 gigabytes of VRAM instead of the 8 gigabyte mobile and the additional performance headroom. So that was all good. But here's the thing. Like I said, if I throw in parts, I didn't think too hard about all these. I did a lot of sorting prices, low to high with the 9950 X3D. That's the desktop kind of variant on this 16-core, 32-thread X3D processor with an AIO cooler that would actually fit in a fairly small case, although this case is still like 20 liters or so. So that's one of the things. When you're trying to build a really small system as a DIY build, I start to get uncomfortable ordering parts and being like 100% sure everything is going to fit. So that is a advantage to going a pre-built route when you're going with a smaller sort of system. Not that you can't research it and get it correct, but that is something to say about DIY builds. Is I don't mind building a PC at all in a full-size case, but the smaller they get, the trickier it can get to get everything to fit or be sure that everything is going to fit when you're ordering the parts. So just one thing to think about. Anyway, went with like with the lowest priced 2 terabyte SSD. I went with the lowest priced 64 gigabytes of RAM, but that's still $870, and that's my thing. So yes, this comes out a little bit less than this, and it's a DIY build. You're not paying for the assembly, and it's in a slightly bigger case, that kind of thing. But like I said, here's what I would actually do if I was trying to target this level of gaming performance, but in a DIY build. First of all, I wouldn't get the 16-core 32-thread CPU. I would at most get a 9800 X3D, and I'd be even tempted to go back to 7800 X3D. So if I go to a 9800 X3D to get the 8-core 16-thread part, sure, it might be less useful in a productivity workload that was heavily multi-threaded, but for a gaming build, this is going to be just as good. Also, like I said, for the memory, it's $870 to buy the cheapest 64 gigabyte kit here. I would absolutely not do that for a gaming build targeting this performance level. Personally, I would at most get 32 gigabytes of memory in the current memory pricing. So two 16 gigabyte kit, sort prices low to high. You can get $370 for DDR5 4800 cast latency of 40. Now, the kit in this system, it didn't publish the cast latency. I guess I could have looked more into that, but it was a 5600 kit, which I did verify in Task Manager. So if I'm going for at least that, it looks like my next step up here is actually DDR5 6000 CL36 memory. So I'll go with that for a little bit additional money. But again, hundreds and hundreds of dollars less than going with a 64 gigabyte kit. I could cut back to a 1 terabyte SSD, but even leaving a 2 terabyte in here, but again, in a DIY build, I have the option to go down to the 1 terabyte. And then keeping in the 5070. Now, I want to talk about the 5070 right now, because some of you might not believe that $700 is the least expensive 5070 I can find right now. But I'm not kidding. On PC Part Picker, the lowest price 5070 that I could find today was $700. This is a 9070 GRE that's just showing up when I type in 5070, but the lowest price 5070 that's actually in stock today in the United States is $700. There's not much of that, and then it jumps right up to $800 models. Like, this is prices went through the roof since I checked a couple weeks ago. 5070's got a lot more expensive. Like I said, I slotted in like a small case that would fit a small AIO, and I think all of this would fit together, but this is still bigger than what they have in this build. I think this is like a 23 liter case or something like that. So yeah, 23 liters. So this is definitely still bigger than the GMK build. And now I know there's smaller cases available. I don't really specialize in that kind of build. And I went with a good quality but not overpriced 850 watt power supply. Now this is coming in at right about $2,000. So this is still an expensive build. And like I said, we could still shave some price off of this. We could drop to a 1 terabyte SSD. You could even go back to 16 gigabytes of system RAM, although that will start to impact you in certain situations. I could go back to a 7800 X3D, so I could still shave additional money off of this. But like I said, this $2,000-ish build here that I put together would have pretty much the same gaming performance, although some loss in multi-threaded productivity on the CPU compared to this build, but for significantly less money. Like I said, their website is showing a 32 gigabyte RAM plus 1 terabyte SSD option, but when I select it, it doesn't seem like it's currently in stock. So now, I was looking into, so why do they use a 16-core 32-thread CPU? Now, I'm not as familiar with the mobile space. When I was looking into this, it doesn't seem like there is an 8-core version of this kind of CPU for this like mobile on desktop kind of build. So there are currently leaks and rumors pointing to a 9800 HX3D possibly coming in 2027, but these are leaks and rumors. So that's a place where I guess if they're going with this style of mobile on desktop build to get this small of a case but still kind of feel like a desktop PC, then I guess that's why they're locked into that 16-core 32-thread part. So it'd be interesting if in the future there will be variants that are more, I think, appropriate for gaming and hopefully would have an appropriately reduced price. That would be 8-core 16-thread, but I guess that explains what's going on here. Now, I did run a bunch of benchmarks. So what exactly am I benchmarking? So on the left here is this GMKtec NEO X1 Pro with the 5070, the one from Yeston that we saw there. It's got that 9955 HX3D, and it has the 64 gigabytes of DDR5 5600. Now, I'm benchmarking it against the PC that you saw in, where was it? This photo at the beginning. This is my normal benchmarking PC that is based on a 9800 X3D, and I just put a 5070 in there. Now, my 5070 that I've benchmarked in this system is is a Founders Edition model, so it's not exactly the same 5070. So when you see like a 2 or 3% performance variation, sometimes that can just be like the difference in GPU model, and really that's not something you would notice in normal use. So I wanted to confirm through my benchmarks a couple of things. One is mostly that it matches the performance of a high-end 9800X3D based desktop CPU in actual gaming workloads. So that's what you're looking at it compared against on the right, and you can see the relative performance compared here as both a average FPS number and a percentage differential. If you're curious about things like 1% lows and such, if I play this forward just a second, you can see the 1% lows is the third FPS number here. Now, unfortunately, after I started editing the footage together, I realized that my overlays for MSI Afterburner were set up in slightly different orders between these two PCs, and I know that that makes it frustrating to compare between the two. Sorry, I wasn't going to redo all of the benchmarks just because I noticed that at the end once I had done them all and was editing together the footage. So one thing to note on the desktop PC is you can see the GPU temperature on the right here, and it's kind of at the bottom, whereas the GPU temperature was showing up here. Let me actually resize this window slightly so you can see that a little bit better. There we go. And you can see that comparison point there. And I did want to double check that temperatures didn't go out of control or anything like that. So let's look at some benchmarks so you can get an idea of what is the gaming performance of this thing, but also how does it compare against the desktop PC that in this case, although it's not the exact parts I'm showing you in this build, because I built the rest of the PC at a different time when components were different, it would come out to around all the performance would match basically here, all the performance related parts. So it's basically up against a significantly less expensive desktop PC, although it would be a bit bigger, you know, that kind of thing for those trade-offs. So that's what we're looking at here. In the side-by-side footage. Now, in Forza Horizon 6 at 1440p extreme settings at native resolution, I saw that both averaged 102 FPS, so it was exactly identical performance between the two PCs. When looking at temperatures on the GMKtec PC, the GPU stayed fairly cool here, no big concerns. Same thing with the CPU. And I don't have any great way of measuring like decibels or sound volume or anything like that. I'm not really set up to do that, but I can say that I could hear the fans, but just like any other desktop PC, whereas some mini PCs I've tested in the past got really obnoxiously loud. Also, I was testing it in its performance setting, which you can change in the BIOS. You can reduce the power limits a little bit in the BIOS, I guess if you wanted to conserve on power or volume for some reason, but I left it in its out-of-the-box setting, which was the higher performance mode. Like I said, you can see that both PCs getting basically exactly the same performance here. I also tried out DLSS balanced on the 1440p extreme settings, and you can see that both PCs had about the same performance here. In this case, the NEO X1 Pro actually came out ahead by 2% or 3 FPS. It's 126 FPS versus 123. That's likely just, like I said, I mean, they're different PCs, and the Yeston 5070 could potentially boost slightly higher than my Founders Edition 5070 on the other PC, and there's just run-to-run variants, and they're two different PCs. So I would still class this as indistinguishable performance. So the point is we're showing that it does match the performance of a desktop PC, and the mobile CPU is keeping up. The 9955HX3D is keeping up even when we're going to upscaling on a 1440p output. Where we're getting to pretty high frame rates, it doesn't seem like the 9955HX3D is really holding it back compared to the desktop 9800X3D, although we're not completely CPU limited in that test or anything like that. Now, I also tried out the maximum settings, which is extreme with RT, which maxes out all the RT settings as well. And in this case, I actually saw a 5% advantage for the NEO X1 Pro at 84 FPS versus 80, which was a little bigger advantage than I expected, but still within 5%. There's run-to-run variants. It is two different PCs. So both are getting solid performance here, 84 FPS versus 80. And like I said, the temperatures and things like that didn't seem like anything to really notice or write home about. Now, if I jump forward here a little bit, another thing I looked at testing here, not for side-by-side compare it to the desktop, but just like, I actually am looking for a PC to use on my bedroom 4K TV. That was not just a joke at the beginning of the video. So a 5070 with 12 gigabytes of VRAM and not like as much performance as you'd get out of like a 5070 Ti or a 5080 or 5090. There could be some questions on how does it hold up if you're trying to use this as a console style PC where you are using it attached to a 4K TV? Because I think for some people who want a smaller PC, that's actually what they want it for, is to be in more of a home theater environment, in which case you're attaching it to a 4K TV. So here I'm looking at the maxed out graphic settings, extreme with RT, but I'm allowing DLSS performance mode, which from a distance on a 4K TV usually looks great. Now, still though, I think the VRAM's holding it back here a little bit, and it's not averaging 60 FPS, and it's reporting going above its VRAM allocation. It was starting to get some stutters. So maxing this game out on a 12 gigabyte card at 4K, even with DLSS performance, just didn't quite work. However, going down to the high with RT preset did work. So 4K DLSS performance mode, high with RT preset. Now I'm averaging well over 80 FPS, and this would probably be the settings I would use on the 4K TV. So I'm gonna do that with each of the games we test here, is I'll look at the 1440p performance, which I think makes sense for a desktop 5070, but then I'll also look at what sort of settings are working on a 4K output. Being a 5070, you sometimes have to be a little bit more mindful of the settings and not just assume DLSS will solve the problem, especially if you hit any VRAM issues. Now, Forza Horizon 6 is particularly VRAM heavy. Not all games will go that high, but more and more games will go past 12 gigabytes at 4K on their maximum settings these days. The next game I tested was Resident Evil Requiem at 1440p max settings with path tracing, DLSS balanced. Once again, I'm seeing matched performance between the desktop PC and the not quite mini PC, but small NEO X1 Pro. 53 FPS on both here. So, I mean, if I'm playing on a TV with a controller or something, like maybe it's okay. I'd rather be over 60 FPS though, for sure. So maybe path tracing is a bit much here for the 5070. So I tried 1440p max preset, but with the RT settings set to high rather than path tracing, and went to native resolution rather than DLSS balanced. And this is now averaging 59 FPS and 58 FPS respectively, so I'm getting a 1 FPS advantage for the NEO X1 Pro, run-to-run variants, maybe the Yeston GPU's boosting tiny bit higher maybe, that type of thing. Anyway, so 1 FPS difference, 2% advantage. That's a good performance level. However, if you use those same settings with DLSS balanced, I'm now getting 98 FPS on the NEO X1 Pro and 96 FPS on my DIY PC. So again, a 2% advantage for the NEO X1 Pro. And we're nearly 100 FPS here, which I think would be pretty solid for this game. Next thing I decided to test was, what if we just turn ray tracing off and go to the normal preset? So 1440p normal preset with ray tracing turned off at native 1440p. I may be able to get 109 FPS on the NEO X1 Pro, and that's 2% faster than the 107 FPS I got on my DIY PC build. And then I was testing out once again, what if I'm playing this game on a 4K TV, using this more as like a console style build. And in this case, I'm getting at 4K normal settings with RT off and DLSS performance. You can see that I'm averaging around 100 FPS. So I could certainly turn some graphic settings up, but the VRAM usage can go up pretty considerably when you start turning on ray tracing in this game, so I didn't want to push that or anything. This seemed to still look pretty good, and getting 100 FPS or so, this seemed like a good experience. I also tested out Crimson Desert 1440p Ultra at native settings. Was native TAA was 70 FPS on the NEO X1 Pro, putting it 1 FPS and about 1% faster than my DIY build, which was hitting 69, which is objectively still pretty nice. Now for this game, I thought if I was playing at 4K, what if I just try the Ultra preset still, but use DLSS performance? And that did get me over 60 FPS, kind of 60-ish, 65-ish, depending on what scene I'm in, lots of foliage, all of that. And if I'm playing on a 4K TV with a controller in a console-style environment, 60-ish FPS in this style of game would be plenty for me. I also I wanted to test out an Unreal Engine 5 game and went with last year's Game of the Year for most outlets with Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Now being Unreal Engine 5, if you want epic settings at native resolution, it's pretty demanding, and even at 1440p, a 5070 can't quite get you to 60 FPS. It's 47 and 48, this time a 1 FPS advantage to the DIY PC. But if you use DLSS balanced on the epic settings at 1440p, it's now 79 FPS on the Neo X1 Pro and 78 on the DIY PC, so now the 1 FPS advantage goes to the Neo X1 Pro. I also tested out medium settings, but at native resolution on 1440p. Here I'm getting 85 FPS on the Neo X1 Pro and 82 FPS on the DIY PC, so 3 FPS and 4% advantage for the Neo X1 Pro in this case. And then I tried using DLSS balanced on the medium settings, but at 1440p, and this got me 122 FPS on the Neo X1 Pro and 119 FPS on the DIY PC build, so 3% and 3 FPS advantage for the Neo X1 Pro here. But then I wanted to look at, again, what if I'm playing this game on my 4K TV, using this more like a console-style PC. And in this case, 4K epic settings with DLSS performance actually did average very close to 60 FPS. I got about 58 FPS in this scene, so if I'm on a variable refresh rate TV, which I do have, I'm absolutely fine with this. But some people's TVs don't support variable refresh rate, so sometimes I do want to chase something that more consistently stays well above 60 FPS in case you need to VSync lock to 60 at 4K. And in this case, I went to 4K high settings with DLSS performance, and now I'm averaging 70 in the mid-70s. And even the 1% lows are staying over 60. So this would be good if you wanted to VSync lock to 60 and not have to worry about the dips and screen tearing when you get that if you're on that style of a home theater setup. I did also check out medium settings at DLSS performance just to see what kind of, FPS we could get, and that averaged closer to 90 FPS in this opening scene, which is fairly demanding with all the NPCs and all that. So I thought that was pretty solid. Now, I also wanted to test out a few other games. So to be honest, I am really looking at using this on my bedroom 4K TV. And some of the games that I play don't support DLSS. So on a 4K TV, they don't support DLSS. That can be an issue on a 5070, except that most of the games that don't support DLSS are older games. So for example, I've restarted Dark Souls 3 recently. And so I was curious, can we just max it out at native 4K? And the answer is absolutely. This game automatically has a 60 FPS cap. From Software games tend to do that. And yeah, you can just max the game out at 4K, native resolution, 60 FPS lock, and you can see that the GPU is actually only around 50% utilized. So there's actually tons of headroom here, which is nice because then it runs at lower power and actually makes the whole PC quieter. So that's one nice thing with the frame rate caps, by the way, too, is if you cap at a frame rate lower than what you're able to get at those settings, then your GPU can throttle down and then it's cooler, it runs quieter, that kind of thing. Another game I've been finishing up is Divinity Original Sin 2. This is another game that does not support DLSS. This is the game that Larian made before Baldur's Gate 3, and by the way, it's excellent. Anyway, at 4K Ultra settings, native resolution, here I'm averaging well over 160 frames per second at native 4K, so that was pretty solid. And let's see, another game that I like to play, especially if I'm playing on a controller and just kind of relaxing for a minute here, is Lumen's Arise. And at 4K max settings, native resolution, like this is 300 FPS. So my point of testing these last few is, for one, because these are games I'm actually playing personally, so it was for my own use case to test, and figured I'd share the results with you. But also, again, think about that 5070 if I'm trying to think of this in a home theater kind of environment, right? Because that's one reason you might want a smaller PC is for a home theater environment. Is the 5070 strong enough? And the answer is you kind of have to go DLSS performance mode and reduce the graphic settings in the latest AAA games, but you don't have to reduce the graphic settings enough to really be problematic. Although you do have to think about the longevity doing that as we get into like the PS6 generation and all of that. But if you're like me and oftentimes you're playing older games that don't even support DLSS, fine, you can still max them out at 4K on something like a 5070, because if you're playing older games, you know, they were designed to run on lower end hardware. So do I have some final thoughts on this overall review of the GMKtec NEO X1 Pro? I mean, overall, just as a PC, I would say that, like, you know, I thought the fan noise was acceptable for a small system, not nearly as annoying as these smaller PCs that I've tested in the past. I liked that it was more of a desktop style PC where I could actually upgrade the where did I put the video of the GPU swap? Where you could actually upgrade the GPU in the future, which I really like. Easy to swap out the SSDs, that kind of thing. So overall, as far as build quality goes and how it was shipped to me, I have no problems with that. Like I said, my biggest problem with it is that I think the version that makes sense for gaming is the 32 gigabyte and 1 terabyte SSD, if that got enough of a price reduction. But the only one that I'm seeing in stock, and the one that was shipped to me, has the 64 gigabytes of RAM and 2 terabyte SSD. And maybe you'd want the 2 terabyte SSD, but with the 2 slots, if I could save money right now, just get by on a 1 terabyte SSD and then slot in an additional one if prices hopefully come down again someday. I'd like to have that option to save the money. So that's my biggest criticism. Now, as it's spec'd out here with 64 gigabytes of RAM and a 2 terabyte SSD and with a 16-core 32-thread CPU, the price isn't that crazy compared to building that yourself. It's just that I wouldn't build that myself. This is not the configuration I would choose for a gaming system. If I was going to spend additional money on a gaming system, like I said, I would go 8-core 16-thread, which I can do on a normal desktop build. Like I said, with their mobile on desktop platform that they're using here, that might be available in the future if they're trying to go with the X3D parts, but isn't now, so there's that. But I would rather throw the money at a more powerful GPU, especially if I'm trying to go into like a home theater PC type environment, because we saw that the 12 gigabytes of VRAM was causing me some issues in some titles, especially at 4K, which you'd probably be doing in a home theater type environment. So with that being said, if I was going to go up to $2,800, I would consider throwing additional money at the GPU side of things. Now, 5070 Ti's right now aren't great value, but if you want to go the NVIDIA route, I could still fit in a 5070 Ti into my desktop build and still come in under $2,400. And this would have noticeably more gaming performance compared to the build as we're seeing it here, because instead of throwing money at system RAM, I'm throwing at a more powerful GPU. And this 9955 HX3D CPU is fast. It keeps up with a more powerful GPU, so it's not wasted. So you could throw additional money there. Another thing I'd like to mention is if I'm going with this kind of home theater PC build, if I'm building it myself, I would be very tempted to go with AMD and do a Steam OS or Bazite or some kind of Linux build, which, you know, I've tried using Xbox mode on Windows and then booting into, or even having just Windows just auto boot into Steam Big Picture, and it works okay. But there's something to be said for the option to go with those routes, and also like a 9070 XT. Cost less than a 5070 Ti for about the same performance, other than, you know, feature set differences, path tracing, things like that. But now I'm still back to about $2,000 on the build. And for $2,000, I've now fit in a 9070 XT, which is more powerful than the 5070 that they've got there. Heck, for the price that they're charging for this version at $2,900, I think I could even fit in a 5080 if I really wanted to. Let's see. I mean, they're crazy expensive right now. Looks like $1,400, but I could fit in a $1,400 there, and I'm still at about $2,700, so still a little bit less money. So if I was to build something like this myself, I would throw the money at the GPU, not at getting 64 gigabytes of system RAM and a 16-core 32-thread system. That being said, again, this is in a little bit bigger of a case. You can do desktop PC builds even smaller than this, but it does start to get a little bit tricky. So that's my main thing. I think that this is a solid PC. It performed well. I think it will do a good job at what it's designed to do, and I didn't see any signs of build issues in my exploration. The noise seemed fine. And at the small form factor, it does a really good job of fitting into a space that I couldn't fit a bigger DIY build into. So it does all of that well. It's not a bad system. It's just, like I said, the configuration here is not ideal from a performance per dollar perspective. That's my issue with it. Anyway, as I mentioned, this was shipped to me as a review sample. I didn't buy it myself, but I was very clear with them that they would have no influence on what I said in this video. All testing was done without them seeing it ahead of time. I am not showing them this video before I post it or anything like that. They did ask that I include links to the system in the description, which would make sense because if you're trying to buy this anyway, you would go through that. And I think they may be tracking them to see performance or something like that. But I want to be clear, they're not paying for a sponsored, like me tell you this is great kind of situation or anything like that. They have no influence on what I said here or anything like that. But there will be a link to it in the video description if you're interested. Like I said, I wish there was some 32 gigabyte, 1 terabytes in stock and that we could see what the pricing was on that because it's not even showing us what that pricing would be. All right. Hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.